This is Alexandra Palace. Opened in 1873 as a palace of the people, and held in public trust to this day, it is both taller and wider than London's royal residence, Buckingham Palace. It's nearly 240 metres end to end, and in this series I'm building it out of Lego. In the previous video I worked on the West Tower. This time we're looking at the first of the palace's distinctive colonnade sections. We're going to run through the construction footage of this section quite quickly, because the build was fairly straightforward and a little repetitive in places. Instead, I'm going to talk more about the design of this section, which really defined how the whole model would turn out. Putting in the floor for this section, you can see I'm using a lot of tiles rather than leaving studs showing. I went back and forth on this a bit. I know if you hide almost all the studs on a model, it can sometimes stop looking like Lego anymore. I ultimately decided to tile all the surfaces though, for a couple of reasons. First, because a lot of the studs not on top techniques used throughout the model meant that quite big sections of it had no visible studs anyway. Secondly, the scale of the model meant that I was intentionally using studs and other small features of Lego bricks to represent particular details or textures from the real building. So I thought it would be a bit distracting or confusing to have studs showing elsewhere on the model where they weren't serving the same purpose. A good example of that subtle texture is in these ground floor pillars. The real building has these horizontal lines running the whole way along it, which I'm mostly representing elsewhere using masonry bricks. Those lines also appear in these pillars, but at the scale I'm working, those are just a single stud wide and deep, which is smaller than the smallest masonry bricks. I tried a few other ways to suggest these lines, but they were all a bit too chunky, so I went for something much subtler, building part of the pillar using single square plate pieces, not perfectly aligned, to just suggest a bit of texture and some continuity of those horizontal lines across the building. I did slightly come to regret this decision when it came to building 24 of these pillars out of tiny tiles. At this point I was also a bit worried about the stability of this section of the model. Not only is it wider than the camera lens can fit in, it's also wider than the table I was building on, and at this stage of the build, quite bendy and not self-supporting. I thought I might need to reinforce with some long Technic bricks or something. Fortunately, once I got the first floor in place, that was enough to give the model some rigidity. A lot of Lego design comes down to finding the right parts. I spent a while looking for something to represent the metal canopies here. I tried various fences and other pieces, but they were all just too much for the scale of this model. I settled on these profiled bricks, which were a bit more subtle. They weren't available in sand green, which might have been the closest colour match here, but sand blue worked quite nicely. One of the challenges with this section is that it's mostly empty space, and I don't have a lot of structure to support the features that are present. The pairs of pillars each side of these towers ended up needing to be positioned somewhere there weren't any studs for them to rest on, due to some of the detailing of the ledge running along the first floor and around each tower. So those pillars are actually attached at the top and just hang off a piece which then rests on a single stud wide support hidden behind the tower facade. The upper floor of this section is probably the most consequential part of the whole design, because it was actually the first part of the model that I designed, and that meant it set the scale and determined the overall size of the entire model. I did quite a few experiments at quite a wide range of different scales, trying to find something that looked right for this section, which has a series of arches supported by narrow pillars. The design I ended up with uses quite a tricky building technique. The pillars themselves are very straightforward, they're just a round support piece topped with a plate. The pillars at the back are a little more complicated. They're built from 1x2 masonry bricks, with the narrower portion towards the front of the pillar actually made from a tile and plates attached to a hinge joint. The arches at the back of the model are really simple, using very common arch pieces on top of those 1x2 masonry brick pillars. The keystones here are made with small curved pieces connected to pins in a reddish-brown Technic brick, which makes up for the lack of a 1x2 brick with a side stud in that colour. To prevent the keystones from rotating and to provide a bit more support for the roof, they're each capped by a 2x2 plate. The towers here provide just enough space to each hide a wall hook for mounting the model, and again it was this section that defined the size that these wall hooks could be while remaining hidden. The hooks attach using some bricks with Technic pins, and two of them provide enough support for this 3 foot wide section. The trickiest elements and the real key to the whole design are the arches at the front of the upper floor. Because the pillars here are only one stud wide, that's not enough room to support a series of regular arch pieces like at the back of the model, because each pair of arches would need a 2-stud footing to rest on. Instead, I used these inverted half arch pieces, which are actually mounted sideways and joined together at the top by a 1x1 Technique brick, which also acts as a subtle keystone detail. This does leave a small gap between each arch, which is covered by another curved piece tucked in behind it. I'd previously made a few different attempts to start designing this model, and had never got very far. It was finding a solution for this series of arches supported by slender pillars that allowed me to finally start making progress, and the rest of the design followed. This was also towards the larger end of the different scale options that I'd tried out, and it would put the overall width of the model at nearly 3 meters or 10 feet. There's quite a bit of texture and detail along the top of the model here, using thin plates and tiles stacked together in different ways to represent the brickwork of the building. This section of the model is topped out by these chimneys, using some circular and jumper plates in reverse as a simple but effective way to achieve the detailed masonry work at the front, and a good example of using the particular shapes of Lego pieces to represent different features. And that's the section complete. Here's a quick demo of how it fits together with the previous section, the West Tower, which just slots into place with a single stud connection to provide alignment. Next time we'll move on to the central section of the model, and the main entrance to the Great Hall. Until then, thank you for watching, and happy building!